Thanks everyone for joining again. Today we have the privilege of having Nash here with us. He's an experienced entrepreneur and a committed activist. He's the CEO of Jeg & Sons, a company he founded in 2006 to bring no contract and unlocked phones to US e-tailers and retailers. In 2019, he delivered a talk named Escaping Porn Addiction that has garnered more than 5.3 million views. Eli has taken an active role in the nonprofit world through his involvement in numerous nonprofits. Having experienced sexual abuse as a child, Eli is passionate about empowering others to speak up and to use their voice to be an agent of change in their community. Eli is also the host of the Search of More podcast, where he invites listeners to explore with him on his search of more from himself and more from life. Thanks for coming on today, Eli.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan.
So let's start with your story. I know many viewers aren't aware of your story, so I'm wondering if you can share a little bit of your story and your journey in life in general.
Okay, so you tell me how much in detail to go into, stop me, or ask me questions along the way. But I was born in Brooklyn, in Crown Heights, Chabad community. The Chabad headquarters is in Brooklyn. My parents both became observant in their mid to late 20s and raised a observant Jewish family in Crown Heights. I'm the third of 9 children. Our upbringing was relatively traditional for a family in the Crown Heights community. My mom was of Sephardic descent, my dad of Ashkenaz descent, so experienced both sides of that world, of course. And as I got older, even though I stayed in the yeshiva system and eventually I even graduated to become a rabbi from a rabbinical school in Florida. Actually, I completed my studies there. Life took me a little bit away from orthodoxy, both by going into business, which was not traditional for the way I was raised. Many Chabad people don't take that path, but also I moved away from Judaism in most ways. I like to say that the only thing that kept me connected to Judaism was the mitzvah of tzedakah, right? Was giving charity. Wow. Other than that, I was very disconnected. Through the course of my adulthood, eventually recognizing that a sexual abuse experience that I had as a child, or more than one experience, a several-year period of being sexually abused, affected me tremendously. So in part of healing that, I also recognized the way pornography and sex addiction and pornography addiction was affecting me. As I began working on that, part of my story and path has been, as I get something, I share it, and I share it verbally. So it's like, hey, I found this ice cream, it's pretty good, let me tell everyone about it. I found recovery, it's pretty good, let me tell everyone about it. I found Judaism, it's pretty good, let me tell everyone about it. Or refound Judaism. So here I am today, and as you mentioned, amongst other things in the business world and also somewhat in the activist world. And today a lot of that is done through my podcast, the In Search of More podcast, where I interview people, share my own stories and perspectives, and kind of take people on alongside me on my journey. I expect the podcast and what we're talking about to change fairly significantly year to year, because I believe the greatest tragedy is stagnancy. So
I agree totally. So you grew up. I remember I watched your TED Talk, very inspiring, and I think it's very relatable to a lot of people nowadays, especially men, I believe, but general for most people. And I recall you mentioned something that you felt always uncomfortable growing up, and you felt a certain amount of peace when you visited your grandmother. Mm-hmm. And then after your grandmother became ill and you started, you didn't visit her that often. You developed a relationship with with an individual that you also felt comfortable, but he ended up abusing you. And then I'm wondering if you can, expand on that story. You probably know your story better than me.
Right, sure. So in terms of those details, one of the reasons I brought up that story of my grandmother is because oftentimes when someone is struggling with addiction, they have a lot of shame surrounding it. And they think, I can't believe I would do this. It's disgusting that I'm engaging in this behavior. Maybe it's not the behavior that they're disgusted by, maybe it's the dependency on it and how much they've given up. I know people who, in their addiction, they missed the birth of their first child. Like they left the room because they were looking sometimes for a hit of a drug or pornography or something else. So my point in sharing that story of my grandmother's home and the peace and safety that I found there is that in addiction, we're also looking for something positive, not going there to destroy our life. It ends up happening that way, but originally the search starts in much the same way a child would, just looking for peace and safety and security, which is a good and noble pursuit. In my story, after I lost my grandmother and growing up in a large family without a lot of money and I didn't feel a tremendous sense of safety in that environment. I started searching for it elsewhere, and the next person was not as nice and kind as my grandmother. So then I said, okay, if I can't find it in people, let me find it in things. And that's what started and led to that addiction.
So there's a relationship between trauma and experiencing trauma and going into addiction or addictive behaviors. I've seen this quite a long time, often you see this. But in your story, I was thinking, do you think that if you had an experience, because you had this need for peace, for feeling peace, and that you found in your grandmother, and then you found it in, pornography and in other ways, do you think if you wouldn't have had that experience, that traumatic experience, you would have still, fallen into that addiction? Or do you believe that there's a correlation between trauma and addiction?
There's definitely a correlation between trauma and addiction. What I've learned is that my trauma was not the sexual abuse. The sexual abuse was my response to the trauma I was feeling. And I'll explain what I mean. I was sexually abused consistently over a 3-year period. What would you expect of a child who feels healthy, who feels secure, who someone tries to or is successful at abusing them one time? What would they do? They would tell their parents.
Yeah.
I didn't tell my parents. Why not? Because I didn't feel a sense of safety. So when was I traumatized? When I was sexually abused or before that? And that's the reason that I was sexually abused. So I think this is true in most cases of sexual abuse specifically. Unless it's a one-time occurrence, most likely that child was not feeling a sense of safety and security before. They were already traumatized. And the person who abused them recognized that vulnerability, picked up on it, and took advantage of it. So there is a correlation between trauma and abuse. My childhood was not perfect until I got abused. There was trauma before then.
And at what point did you notice that you had this addiction and you decided to, seek therapy?
At what point did I admit it to myself? That means maybe a little bit different than noticing. Because we can have suspicions, but to actually admit it to myself, like it's undeniable, was when I got into a relationship with the woman who eventually became my wife. And it was the first time I truly tried to stop the behaviors. If you hear my story, and I talk about it on the TED Talk, is that I tried to stop many times. But when I failed, I went right back to the behaviors. It wasn't a concerted effort, a consistent concerted effort. The first time that happened was when I got into a relationship. I was about 27 or 28 years old. Today I'm 38. And I saw I was helpless. I was helpless. At the beginning of the relationship, everything was fine. I had it was beautiful. We're in this love bubble. And then the second that was punctured, and I said, hey, what about if I masturbate or watch pornography, something that in that moment I was able to excuse. Afterwards, I was feeling guilty. And then maybe I'm lying to my girlfriend, and all of that, those stories turned into a tremendous amount of shame, which meant more and more of those behaviors. And I was doing everything I could to stop it because I felt like I was betraying my girlfriend. I was lying to her, but I couldn't. And when I saw how helpless I was, I understood that I have an addiction.
But you were in therapy before, right? Before you admitted to yourself that you had this addiction. You never shared it with your therapist?
No. I was in therapy before, but I was dealing with the effects of the abuse. And at one point in time, he did ask me about, more than ask me, he shared a book with me called Out of the Shadows by Patrick Carnes, which is a book about sex addiction. And he shared with me years later why he gave that book to me. He gave that book to me because another therapist he sent me to, who does a diagnostic evaluation, clinical evaluation of a person, said that personalities like mine could end up with a sexual addiction. So the therapist was searching for it, and he even gave me the book to read, and I said, no, I don't think I have it. The reason I didn't think I have it, because I never truly tried to stop. It was very helpful that I had those conversations with the therapist, because that's what I did. When I got into a relationship and I was not able to stop by myself, that's who I went back to. And I wasn't using the term addiction at that point. I wasn't. I just said to him, I don't know what's going on. I can't stop these behaviors. I feel like, I think I described it as a magnetic pull. My car is just a magnet between my strip club, my car and the strip club. And I just get out of the office and somehow it, it draws me there. And that's when he gave me the book again, the same book.
Did you read it?
I read it. I couldn't believe how much the guy learned about me in a few years.
Wow.
So yeah.
And I think, I mean, you touched on shame. How was it like sharing this with your wife, your current wife, which was your girlfriend at the time? Did you share this with her? I mean, how did she react? And did you feel shame? Not only sharing, because I can imagine sharing it with a therapist. If you felt shame in sharing it with a therapist, I cannot, even imagine sharing it with other people that aren't, your therapist. I must imagine that it was a lot
right.
tougher.
It's a progression, right? As you can imagine, I'm not talking about pornography for the first time right here in this conversation. If I was, there may be a lot more shame. So it started with my therapist. My therapist introduced me to a patient of his who was in recovery for sex addiction. And he said, why don't you speak to him? I had a couple conversations with him, and he invited me to a 12-step meeting. And then in that meeting, I'm meeting 15, 20, 30 people every single night who are dealing with this. Eventually, by the time I shared it with my wife, I actually overshared because I was feeling so good about what that feels like. You're holding on to the secret for a long time. Or I was holding on to a secret for a long time. And then all of a sudden I share it with someone and that person responds positively. So I go to the next person, right? I start with my therapist and he says, Ellie, so brave. Let me introduce you to the next person. I introduce him to this guy and he's like, oh, me too. I have the same problem and I'm part of a group where these people have the same problem. And he brings me there. And the more I share, the more positive feedback I get. So I go to my wife and I dumped like a 10-page write-up of my whole sexual history on her head. And I absolutely crushed her. Like, brought her to her knees with it. She wasn't my wife at the time. She was my girlfriend. But I absolutely crushed her with some of the details I said there. So by the time I shared it with her, I wasn't feeling shame, but then I overshared, and then I felt a fair amount of shame when I did that. And then over time, we calibrate.
It seems like, your message is encouraging people that have this experience to actually seek help. I believe so. In a nutshell, that I feel that that's your message. And I think there's this power that once you understand that your problems are not unique to you and that other people are experiencing the same problems that you're experiencing, somehow there's a relief there for you. And I think that you can extrapolate this idea to other areas of life, anxiety, depression, or other areas of life, not necessarily sex addiction.
100%. My message is not about sex addiction. If I titled the TED Talk Escaping Porn Addiction a little bit for clickbait, to be honest. If I was titling it completely true to the topic, the way I start the talk is I say sharing our stories helps move us through shame and others, right? Sharing our stories honestly, it does that for us. So that's across the board. I think that the areas we have shame about are usually areas that are most common in the human experience. And when we talk about it, we'll meet a lot of other humans who are struggling with that same thing.
I want to ask you, what's the difference between being addicted to pornography and watching pornography in general? Because I would say most men nowadays, I don't know, I can't speak for women, but I would say most men are watching pornography, and a lot. When I speak to people, I'm noticing that a lot of people can be considered addicted. So where do you draw the line between addiction and just plainly watching pornography?
Okay, so maybe for this question, sometimes it'll help if we talk about something else other than pornography, because when you talk about sex, people get confused somehow. They think there's different rules around that. So let's take alcohol addiction. What's the difference between someone who drinks a lot of it, or is addicted to it? So obviously most people drink some amount of alcohol, whether it's socially or otherwise. And then some people drink a lot of alcohol, but they may still not be addicted. And then some people are addicted. So in terms of the behavior, I think we all understand that. Some people use it and then they can stop if they want to. Oftentimes, one way of thinking about that is, if you have a reason to stop, will you stop? And someone may drink wine for a while, and then they may be told, okay, you're going to be doing a marathon next week. And as part of the marathon, don't drink wine for a week. That's recommended. So they'll just stop drinking wine. It won't be a big deal. They're okay with it. They like it. They enjoy it. But for them to stop it is not a problem. Then within the category of people who are addicted to it, you have two levels of addiction. One is physical addiction and one is emotional addiction. Let's use those words. Physical addiction is where the body craves something, physically craves something. So for example, if you or I stopped eating sugar, we may not be emotionally addicted to sugar, but for those first 30 days of trying to stop eating sugar, we're going to feel some cravings and discomfort and possibly even sweating or irritability or something else because we've removed sugar from our diet and we're so used to it. After a period of, let's say, 30 days or so, when the sugar has completely left our body, so there's no more craving for it, we can probably live without sugar and without the craving. So that's physical addiction. That's one component to it. And then the next level is emotional addiction, where I'm sure most of us have heard of someone who says, I'm sober for 10 years, but I still won't even drink a sip of wine. So even a kiddush on Shabbos, if they're, a sanctification that's made as a Jewish ritual, what's the harm in taking a sip? They say no. What are they worried about? They're worried what one sip will do, not because of a physical addiction. That's not what they're worried about. What they're worried about is emotionally, the way AA describes this is it's a allergic reaction, and it's an allergy of the mind, body, and spirit. So everything just recoils as soon as it comes in contact with a person's drug of choice. So whether it's alcohol, pornography, or a certain kind of drug, when that person takes it, all of a sudden they're just insane on the level of body, mind, and spirit.
It's interesting because I've spoken to a couple people that have had problems with alcohol, and they cannot take even a sip. And I'm thinking to myself, did you actually overcome your addiction, or are you just escaping from it? Because, if you actually overcame it, isn't it theoretically, intuitively, what I think is if you actually overcame it and came to terms with it and everything, you could do a little bit of alcohol here or mildly. It's interesting because with in the case of food, if you have an addiction to food, you cannot stop eating. So you need to overcome food addiction in a way that you cannot overcome, or that it's not the same for alcohol addiction, because you can completely refrain yourself from having alcohol, but you cannot refrain yourself from having food.
It's a good question, and I think this speaks to why certain addictions are harder to overcome than others. So if you think about, let's use more extreme than alcohol, let's say cocaine. So no one needs cocaine or heroin or something like that in order to survive. So if someone no longer is taking it, but not only they're not taking it, they're not craving it. I once was in an AA meeting, and I heard someone say, I don't think about drinking, I don't think about not drinking. It's just off the table, it's a non-issue. So we would definitely consider that healthier than the person who just stopped. So there's someone who stopped, but all day long they're thinking about it. So they're abstinent, right? They're not engaging in it, just like a dead person is not engaging it, but they're far from sober or far from healthy. Then there's another level, which is, I'm not even thinking about it. I'm not craving it. I'm not fighting it. I'm not wrestling with it. It's just not there. What you're talking about is saying, okay, can you come back and redevelop a normal relationship with it? So I think when it comes to sex, to alcohol, the thought is, why do I need to? Just leave it off the table. Why do I need to test this? I'm playing with fire that could get me burned, so that you should think that this person's healthy. They don't need anyone to think. They just don't want to go back to that behavior. It was too dangerous for them in the past. They're done. When you talk about sex or food, then not doing those behaviors is unhealthy. If you just cut it out completely, it's not possible. So it requires a much truer refinement in some way of a person's recovery in order to get sober. But on my podcast, I spoke to someone, which it's a hot topic and can, throw people off a lot. But I interviewed someone. His name is Omar Pinto, and he was in recovery, 12-step recovery for about 17 or 18 years, and no drugs, no alcohol. And then eventually, he began working with ayahuasca, and through that, he's began drinking again in moderation, and so far, it's a few years in, he's been able to drink moderately, so it looks good. But to impose that on someone from day one is very risky, to say, oh, this is where you should be. and then a person, shame kicks in, and then they can feel unhealthy again. It can bring them right back to their addiction. So we're certainly not saying that, but I have seen instances where people have come back, and sometimes not with ayahuasca. They've just been able to reintroduce it. But I think it's a one-off situation, and someone is better off making that decision with their sponsor in recovery than listening to us and making such important decisions. Exactly.
But you said that, I mean, you have two types of addiction, emotional addiction and physical addiction. But in general, like to overcome any addiction, it's just about, I mean, I'm not an expert in addiction. You probably know a lot more than me, but it's relating a lot more pain to continuing being in the experience than pleasure. I mean, plain Freudian psychology. And you see this in the cases of a person that, I mean, smoking, and the doctor says, if you don't stop smoking today, you're going to die. And the guy immediately stops smoking, these cases. And he doesn't even feel the physical need to smoke. So it seems like your brain is so powerful that you can even overcome physical addiction with associating unbearable pain, such as death, to continuing in the behavior.
Well, not really. Not really, no. So if someone is able to, if that's enough to someone on its own, then it's not an addiction. Remember, I said physical addiction and emotional addiction. Emotional addiction is much higher. Right? I'm making that distinction. This is not terminology. I'm just explaining that the body can crave something, but then the soul or the spirit can crave something. It's a little bit different. When the body craves something, keep the body away for a while and it'll regulate itself. When someone's, I don't call it soul or spirit, when someone like has a deep emotional craving for it, that never goes away unless it's absolutely resolved. And it won't go away just by abstaining for 30 days. So in recovery, 12 steps, the people who are going there to get sober, it's because consequences have not worked for them. If it was just the consequences, then the first time someone got, lost a job or lost a business deal or embarrassed themselves, and they say, okay, I'm never doing that again. I'm never going to drink so much that I can't remember what I did, and I have to make apologies to people I never even met for things I don't remember doing. That would be enough, but it's not enough for people. They keep engaging in these behaviors.
But can you argue that the leverage that this person had wasn't enough? I mean, sometimes death might be enough. For in the case of the person smoking, I mean, I'm trying to play devil's advocate here.
I've heard that death works. When people die, they stop smoking. I've heard that.
No, I mean the fear of death. That's what I mean. I mean,
no, but
the doctor saying if you don't stop, you'll die, and that's enough leverage. Maybe losing a business deal.
Of course not. No, of course not. Think about how many people are dying from drug overdoses in America. So there's not the fear of death. You can't read the amount of fentanyl deaths. So someone who's addicted to drugs and every single day is buying stuff on the street that could be laced with fentanyl that has a high chance of killing them. I want to say high, but a reasonable chance of killing them. And it's happened to hundreds of thousands of people. If that was enough of a deterrence, then no one would be taking any of these drugs. But it's not.
So that explains why some people, it's a deterrence for some people and deterrence for others. And according to your definition, the people that it does work for as a deterrence for them, they're not truly addicted. I guess that's your argument, right? I mean, I
would say not truly addicted. There's a different level of addiction.
Levels, yeah.
Yes, it's not the same thing that they're struggling with. If someone I knew someone who was smoking for 10 plus years, and he said, I understand addiction. I used to be addicted to cigarettes. And I said, why'd you stop? He said, when I met my wife, she asked me not to smoke, so I stopped. I said, then you don't understand addiction. Because I'm sure he was addicted, right? Smoking for 10 years. But once he had a good enough reason, it disappeared. There was no reason that was good enough to me to stop doing any of the behaviors I was doing. When I say that it felt like there was a magnet between my car and the strip club, I'm not exaggerating. That's what it felt like. I was being pulled there. So maybe a different way to think about it. Imagine you have a terrible itch. A terrible, terrible itch. And you're told that if you scratch this, you're going to lose a certain amount of money. Do you think you can go forever without scratching this? No, you can't. Eventually, you're going to scratch it. So the only way to deal with it is to deal with the itch, right? You have to reduce the intensity of this itch. No one's going to be able to stay away forever. And that's really what you're talking about when you're talking about an addiction, is there's an intense craving that goes way beyond the fear of consequences or the fear of even severe consequences.
Do you think, is there such a thing as addictive personalities or people that have like a predisposition to become addicted to certain substances or behaviors as opposed to just nurture or experience that they had in the past?
Right. You're getting into a much bigger conversation than we can tackle here. I can tell you my opinion based on experience, my own and others, is that the people I've met who are severely addicted all have stories of pretty intense trauma. Might there also be some predisposition? Sure. So maybe there's the addictive personality, which maybe we'll call a sensitive person, and a sensitive person with negative experiences will then go on to develop an addiction. And if they didn't have one or both, they wouldn't. But suffice it to say that in my experience, everyone I've met with a very serious addiction has some very, very, very serious trauma. And that can be a lot of different kinds of trauma. I'm thinking of one guy I know who for years fighting an addiction. What happened to him is when he was a child, maybe 4 or 5 years old, he was playing with his son, with his brother in the bath. His brother drowned, and his parents blamed that on him for the rest of his life. So that's not a traditionally traumatic experience, as I don't know, we may think of, but this for sure was the blame and shame that he experienced as a child, and probably in some subtle way his parents, or maybe not so subtle way, put that on him through the years, created a feeling inside him that was so intense that he needed to soothe. That's one example. I don't know why I threw that one out, but you're hearing stories like this. You're not just saying, hey, I think I have an addictive personality. And anytime I've heard someone say that story, I've heard some pretty incredible trauma.
I think this question doesn't only apply to addiction, but also in general to broader questions about depression. I mean, the way that I see it, and at the risk, I mean, I'm not an expert in the matter, but the way that I see it intuitively is like if you're hungry, it's your body telling you you have to eat. It's a signal that your brain and your body is telling you need to behave a certain way for the purpose of survival. If you're depressed, isn't it fair to say that it's your body telling you you're not living the best life? You have to change your behavior. You're not living the best life. You can lead a better life. And in general, I refuse to believe that we are completely incapable of doing nothing, that no matter what we do, we cannot improve our lives and become less depressed, or there's not a calling, if you want to call it spiritual, or, you know, the world, the universe, God is putting that feeling in you because you need to improve yourself, or your body is even telling you to improve yourself. But there is a distinction between that and PTSD, I believe. But if I'm not mistaken, you're correlating both of them, and you're saying that people that fall into depression, most of them experience some kind of trauma.
Right. I'm hesitant to agree with you just saying, yes, you're right, because it can sound like a form of grab yourself by the bootstraps, pick yourself up, it's your fault that you're there, which that message can just keep someone there for longer. That being said, I think it's another conversation about, let's say, depression or anxiety or general mental illness. I'm sure everyone's heard the term chemical imbalance. So chemical imbalance suggests that there's something off, right? That the person it's not because of any reason. There's just some chemicals that are off in the brain, and because of that, they feel a certain way. So what do we need to do? The only thing we can do is chemically rebalance. Again, this is another controversial discussion. My own experience leads me to the conclusion that we're most often using the term chemical imbalance a little bit too loosely, and that there is something in someone's experience that's causing anxiety or depression or something else, and that's not to blame them, that's to empower them. It's a much more empowering position to believe that we can do something about what's going on than otherwise. But when that turns to blame, that can only further someone's problems. We're not blaming them. Maybe it's not their fault that they got there. You're just empowering someone to get out of it. Like, for example, this guy I mentioned whose brother drowned in the bathtub with him, that wasn't his fault. He should have never been left alone with a younger sibling. Years later, I'm sure in addition to his addiction, he had depression, anxiety, or both. Depression or anxiety or both. No one would blame him for having that depression or anxiety. This was thrust on him and imposed on him by his parents, by the universe. So no one's blaming him, but it would be an empowering position to say that, hey, if you're depressed or anxious, it's not because of a chemical imbalance, it's because of a traumatic experience that were you to work on it, which we understand if not, but were you to work on it, it could be healed. Chemical imbalance sounds like there's nothing we can do about it. This other approach I find much more empowering. But if we move that to blame, it becomes dangerous.
Yeah, totally agreed. And I think, that's why people don't want to say it, and they refrain from saying that because they have fear that people are going to call them, they're not sensitive. But again, I haven't met anyone that doesn't matter what they do. Let's say a person works out every single day. I've never met a person that works out every single day, has extreme discipline, and hasn't seen results. So maybe you can extrapolate that same idea to emotional fitness in general. But yeah, I agree in an empowering way. And that leads to my next question. I recall you mentioning that after you recovered from your addiction, there was like 1 or 2 times that you fell back into you watched porn again. So how did you deal with that experience? Because if you would have, blamed yourself and had so much guilt, you would have probably never gotten out of that hole. So how do you deal with the experience of going back to it and then picking yourself up and not staying there?
Right. So let me piggyback on one point that you said before, and I'll answer the question. In terms of people's experiences, it wouldn't be, meaning it's not because of sensitivity and we don't want to be accused of being insensitive that we're saying this. It's actually true, meaning it's very easy for me with my experiences to tell someone else what they should do with their experiences. Yeah. But that's not a true perspective. We don't know what we would do with theirs. So you, who may wake up in the morning with the energy to go to the gym, can point at someone else and say, oh, you never went to the gym, but maybe they lost a child, right, from a cancer that came from nowhere. And you want to have your opinion that they can do something about it? How would anyone else deal with those same circumstances? So it's not just being sensitive to that. It's actually the honest perspective. Do I believe someone could do something about most things? I think they could, but would everyone if they were in the same situation? Possibly not. It's possibly most people wouldn't be able to handle close to what this person did. So it's not coming, we're not trying to be oversensitive for people so no one gets offended. That's not where this is coming from. It's just the honest truth.
No, I agree. Just to touch on that point, I think compassion, you should have compassion and empathy and not, if you were in those shoes, you don't know how you would react.
Exactly.
It's important to have that. I guess my broader point is that some people say, chemical imbalance is a way of shifting responsibility and saying, it's not up to me. It's just something in my brain, and there's absolutely nothing that I can do about it. And I think that's the approach that's wrong. Thinking that you cannot do anything about it I think it's very dangerous because and it's not empowering in the end of the day.
It's a very disempowering perspective. I agree with that.
Yeah.
So, but if we say it with empowerment and not with blame, it'll actually motivate people. It's more likely to motivate someone to action. Then there was a question you asked before, which I didn't.
When you had the experience of falling back into.
I tell this to almost everyone is that if one of the most important ingredients of addiction recovery, but probably much more than this, is the ability to be gentle with ourselves. Meaning, at some point in time, if you're dealing with a real problem, whether it's an addiction, an emotional disorder, depression, anxiety, or anything else, you're not going to go from not being able to manage this to perfectly able to manage this overnight. Even if you ever get to perfectly able to manage this, which is unlikely, you're going to go in stages. So when that happens, right, the very first time I got 60 days free and clean from pornography, you know what I did? I celebrated by watching pornography. Because I felt so good and I didn't know what to do with my feelings, that's where I went back. And what I felt like was, oh my goodness, I lost my 60 days. Here I was, I'm making progress, I felt so good. I had 60 days straight and now I lost my 60 days. And I was speaking to someone who had more experience than me and, beating myself up over it. And he says, what do you mean you lost those 60 days? Those were good days, right? They're always there. Those 60 days would have been different if you watched porn every single day. You didn't, so that's always there. Now you did, okay, let's pick yourself up, see what went right in those days, and next time you'll have a plan. The next time you get to 60 days or 90 days, maybe you'll make a party with a few friends instead of not having that plan because you have a certain amount of energy, right? So you can be a little bit smarter the next time around. So that perspective of knowing how to be gentle with ourselves. That ability, that skill of knowing how to be gentle with ourselves is such a crucial ingredient for recovery. I think the story you're talking about, because recently I shared it. So I started getting sober in about 2013. I stumbled repeatedly till 2017. Sometimes a few days, sometimes a few weeks, sometimes a few months, and back, and on and off. Eventually, beginning of 2017, something shifted, and I was able to get years of recovery. But sometime through, I think it was 2021, halfway through 2021, I was about 4.5 years sober, and I relapsed. Someone gave me a VR headset, and I just got too curious as a gift. I was too curious what porn would have looked like on it, and the thought kept running through my head. I didn't talk to anyone about it, and eventually one night I relapsed and watched, and when I woke up the next morning, I said, oh my goodness, I'm such an imposter. Here I have a TED Talk, I have a podcast. I think I had a podcast at the time. Yeah, I was already doing some discussions. I'm talking to people about this subject. People reach out to me all the time, how I stopped watching porn, and I just went to it. Like, I'm not even a day sober. It's 12 hours, Someone could be calling me with a week sober, and I'm talking to them when I watched yesterday. This whole thing is crazy. And as I started going into this thought pattern, there was another voice behind me and said, Ellie, you keep this up, you're going to fall back. Keep this up. So that's not healthy. That's not a healthy mindset. That's not a healthy approach. That's not going to be a successful approach. Just celebrate it. This is pretty freaking cool. You have 4.5 years sober, and it wasn't so easy. And the proof is that when you had some opportunity, you fell, which means that desire sat there, and somehow for 4.5 years, I managed to stay sober through it. It wasn't like it disappeared. It was work. So celebrate the fact that you got this, and now keep going. And then after that, I started sharing that story, which it did take a different level of gentleness to be able to find gentleness after all that, right? To find gentleness after the TED Talk, to find gentleness after the podcast, to find gentleness after hundreds of people had reached out to me about my pornography addiction and for help with it. To find gentleness there was a different level of gentleness. But today I sit here with much more confidence. I know that I can relapse, and I know how to deal with that. Doesn't mean I want to, I don't want to. But before I wasn't sure. I could have gone either way. Now I know that I've experienced a relapse, and I came right back from it. So, yeah, there's always an opportunity. There's always going to be a need to be gentle with ourselves, and it's a key ingredient if we want to get sober.
You said that you fell back, and then you went out of the addiction and came back into it. Or, I mean, you fell back into the practice of watching porn. But there was a period that you spent 4.5 years. Do you remember what triggered that moment when you said no more, that lasted 4.5 years, that it didn't happen in the previous times that you decided to leave, the practice?
Right, it's a good question.
Because maybe, like, if we can identify what happened there, I mean, maybe
so
we can know if...
Right, but what happened there couldn't have happened without the other 4 years. So I'll answer it, but it wouldn't have been possible for that to happen on day one. So as I started working on my addiction, there's always these other voices that come in, okay, do I need to really give this up 100%? Is that really the way this works? Maybe I can have a little bit of it. And I got into a routine of, I'll stay a few weeks sober, I'll watch a little bit, I'll stay a few months sober, maybe go to a strip club, I'll stay a few weeks sober, I'll do this. And I found a way to kind of manage it, or so I thought. And then I had an experience where I completely not expecting it, where a woman came on to me, and I wasn't prepared, I wasn't in the right frame of mind, and I went much further than I would have wanted to. And after that, and at that point in time, I wasn't married yet, but I was close enough to that. Like our relationship was headed in that direction. And, although I didn't sleep with her, it was close enough that I said, I got to have a recovery that's not so fragile, that someone can just approach me and I can fall off the wagon just like that. The analogy I gave myself was I have to have some air in my tire. If you're driving a car with no tires on a perfectly smooth road, just the metal wheel will probably be fine. But if there's the slightest nick, the wheel's going to start taking a beating. And that's why we have tires, and sometimes thicker and thicker tires, so that there can be a pothole and the car will survive and the axle will survive. So I use that analogy for myself in recovery and said it's not enough just to be sober. I got to be able to withstand a punch. And I went into my recovery at a much different level after that. So I was playing a dangerous game previously where I was saying, okay, a few months sober, a few weeks, sat on the other thing, thinking I can manage the addiction. And once I realized, like, it doesn't work like that. I just have to be sober fully and clean out anything I find that still has remnants of the addiction. Like on Pesach, we find the smallest little bit of Isa, say get rid of it, because those little bits can come back. And I'm not here saying that I've gotten every piece, right? It's sex. Sex is a tough one. Previously, I wasn't even trying. I wasn't even trying to get most. I was doing just the opposite. I was seeing how much I can keep without it overwhelming me.
And do you think there's something inherently evil about pornography in general, or it's just the addiction to pornography? I mean, I'm sure you would say that there's nothing inherently evil about food or about alcohol. I mean, you can have a beer here and there, but about pornography, do you think any pornography is, or neutral, or there's something evil about watching pornography even once, or about the
Right. I think there's a quality to this question that's somewhat moral in nature, right? Would a moral society have pornography available to it? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Would a moral society have alcohol available to it? Like, what reason would we need bourbon and scotch and these other things for? So some of that question is moral. I'm not as comfortable going into that depths. What I will say about pornography is 90+% of the pornography that's made are feeding a very unhealthy industry, but we can say that about eggs. Yeah. We can say that about fruits and vegetables. Meat. Yeah, a lot of these things are feeding unhealthy industries. That too, right? There are people who are, just to share some of the stories, you have people who were brought in for a modeling audition, and next thing they're being pushed to do some, poses that are nude. And if there's an 18-year-old, 19-year-old woman or girl with 10 people around her, she may give in. And if there was a little resistance, they'd put a contract in front of her and say, don't worry, put money in a contract in front of her, plus the peer pressure. And they'll say, don't worry, this will only be shown, in the Philippines and in other countries. It'll never be shown in America. And she'll reluctantly agree, sign the piece of paper, but the piece of paper doesn't say anything about Philippines. It says they have the rights to share it everywhere. And next thing you know, she has pictures uploaded all over the internet. So this is not a one-off story in the industry. These are fairly common. It's not a clean industry. So to feed that, I would agree, is problematic. In terms of whether pornography is moral or not moral, that's a conversation that's completely beyond my pay grade. What is pornography is a different... How many rated R movies have nude sex scenes in it? Is that pornography? Is it not pornography? These are questions that are not for me to answer. My communication is more to someone who already knows that pornography is not for them, has shame around it, doesn't know how to get out of it. So for those people, let's talk to them. We don't have to try to convince the people who don't think there's anything wrong with it that there is. Let's convince the people who have found something wrong with it for them that there's a way to live a life without it.
I didn't mean I don't mean about the moral question behind that. I mean more of from a health standpoint. I mean, if it's healthy for a person, the sexualization of, not in society in general, of people. And I think Andrew Huberman, who I'm sure you're aware of him, he talks about how pornography really distorts the dopaminergic system, because you have a certain level of dopamine that's correlated to the pursuit in general. And when you watch porn, you reward yourself, and there was no pursuit, there was nothing, you didn't do anything, and you're rewarding yourself for something. I mean, you can say the same thing as for movies and other things.
Right, so what is hypersexuality? What is pornography? These questions are so fine. I think when it comes to something like a full-scale pornography, like a Pornhub.com or something, where they're showing those kind of films, so I forget what they call it, something with butterfly something. It's not the butterfly effect, but they took butterflies. I'll tell you this the story, so they took fake butterflies, which were much more colorful, much brighter, much larger than regular butterflies, and they put it into an area with butterflies, and obviously for mating or other reasons, right? They were attracted to the butterflies were attracted to the fake butterfly more than they were to real butterflies, because they were able to make it brighter, make it larger, make it much more compelling than real butterflies actually are. And then when they removed the fake butterflies, the butterflies were less interested in other natural butterflies. I forget what they call it. Maybe we can get a little support from some of the technicians behind us in terms of what that's called. It's like a super, something like a super stimulus, a super something stimulus. I think in that way, pornography can be very dangerous. And I saw that with me. And you have, for example, but this is not for everyone. I saw that for me, it caused me to objectify people more, number one. Mm-hmm. Number two is to sexualize things in general. Like my mind was just thinking of that more. And that supernormal stimulus. Yeah, so you can read that up, the supernormal stimulus, when you take something that's way outside of normal and then the normal response doesn't get the normal stimulus doesn't get the normal response anymore. So in terms of that, and that's probably what Andrew Huberman is talking about, that's not the same as watching a rated R movie and there's a nude scene in there. I don't think Andrew Huberman is talking about that. It's the consistent and persistent use of pornography that they have a disease called PIED, porn-induced erectile dysfunction. And I know people who struggle with this. They cannot orgasm with a human being. It's only from the supernormal response. But that's not everyone. So is it what Andrew Huberman sounds like he's talking about is some sort of level of pornography, either the type of pornography or the frequency of it, that's causing this abnormal dopamine response. But going to a movie where there's an attractive couple getting it on, is that killing the dopamine receptors? I don't think so. I don't think that's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
But from a moral perspective, they're no different.
Oh, totally. And I think our brains, I don't know if our brains are wired for that, because I was listening to also Jordan Peterson. He says that an average 15-year-old nowadays has seen more naked women than the biggest conquerors in history. I mean, think about it. Like with porn, you can see thousands of different women, unlimited amounts of women. And the biggest conquerors in history, they didn't have access to porn. So let's say Genghis Khan, which I think 10% of humanity descends from him. I mean, he slept, let's say, 1,000 women, 1,500 women, 2,000 women. I mean, how? And yet a 15-year-old has seen more naked women than the Genghis Khan. So, I mean, it intuitively, I mean, there must have some effect in your brain.
100%. That effect and that frequency, for sure, has to have an effect. But that's not the same as saying that porn itself is a problem. There's an organization called Fight the New Drug. And what they do is they combat pornography. So the obvious question is, what's new about this drug? Right? This has been going on forever. They've been chiseling pictures of naked women into stones since time immemorial. They call prostitution the oldest profession, right? So in the Bible, there's a story of a prostitute. So of course, and they'll explain, of course this always existed. But what exists today with pornography, the accessibility, the frequency, the amount, the sheer, it's not only the volume, it's the quality of it. Everything about it is a completely new drug. It's like they say the weed that people were smoking in the 1960s and 70s is nothing compared to the potency of the weed that exists today, right? They're manufacturing it with THC levels that didn't exist previously. Now they've figured it out. So the same thing is happening in the porn. While it was possible to see porn in the 1960s and 1970s, it's nothing compared to what they see today. When Playboy started, and they wrestled long and hard with whether or not to put nudity in there. It was a real question, because it wasn't like a gentleman's magazine. Should they do it? And if they do it, how much of it? And can they show just the top half, or also the rest of the body? They really wrestled with these stuff, and today wouldn't even be not even a thought. Everyone Everyone has it on their computer, on their phone, and most people have seen way too much of it.
There's a huge movement also, the NoFap movement. I don't know if you heard about it, but it's like advocating for people not to masturbate and there's many effects on it. But yeah, it's interesting the overstimulation and that definitely an interesting topic there. I want to ask you about psychedelics in general and using psychedelics to, avoid certain addictions or as help, to come out of certain addictions. What are your thoughts in general about psychedelics? And what's the difference between taking psychedelics and SSRIs or other types of depressants, of antidepressants rather?
Okay, so how long do we have on this one? I'm just saying, it's my way of saying that this is a conversation. So I've used psychedelic-assisted therapy myself. I'm not someone who used any psychedelics prior to venturing into this from a therapeutic perspective. And not only that, even though I have an addiction to sex, I did not have one to alcohol or drugs, or other things. Those were not my.
You never took SSRIs or other.
I never took SSRIs. That's something I've never took SSRIs. They were one of my main motivations to get healthy. Every single time a therapist encouraged me to take one form of medication or another, anti-anxiety or something for depression, and I was diagnosed with both anxiety at one point and like a mild grade depression, not like the clinical, but anxiety, like a full-blown anxiety disorder. Although it was recommended to me many times, I always said there has to be a different way. So why did I think that? The reason is that most of these are symptom management. There's a big difference between taking an Advil for a headache or finding out the reason you have a headache and addressing it on that level. Sometimes an Advil is appropriate. Sometimes it is. But it's more useful long term to figure out the reason for it. So the difference between SSRIs and psychedelics is SSRIs, when they work, which they don't always, they address symptoms. Psychedelics, when they work, which again they don't always, they address it more at the root cause.
So at a brain level, on a brain level, SSRIs retain more. I mean, you have serotonin receptors, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that you have serotonin receptors, and SSRIs encourage the release of serotonin and somehow maintains more serotonin in your system, whereas psychedelics treat the receptors. Or I'm wrong with this?
So I've never used SSRIs, but whatever it's doing, all it's doing is giving chemicals to a person, right? Producing chemicals, then someone that they think is responsible for those feelings. So to try to manufacture a different state within someone. Psychedelics are not about just messing with receptors, because psychedelics someone can have one experience and never need it again. Not that that's usually the case, but there are studies of people who had one or two experiences. Recently, I interviewed someone on my podcast who's a scientist at Johns Hopkins University, studying psilocybin and other psychedelic drugs for 20 or so years. And they did a study with people who were dying from mostly cancer, but other very, very severe physical illnesses, where they either didn't have very long to live, or there was a very strong chance that didn't have long to live. And one or two psilocybin sessions, mushroom sessions, completely changed the trajectory of their life. SSRIs never doesn't offer that. No one says, okay, take SSRIs twice and this will remove it. SSRIs are something that if you're going to get the benefits of it, you have to constantly have it in your system. So obviously they're working completely differently. It's more about inducing someone into a certain state, that in that state new connections are formed or new understandings are had that allow someone to free themselves from whatever they're experiencing.
Is it the experience that you encounter when you take a psychedelic, or is it a rewiring in the brain, or both?
I think it's both. So with myself, and I'd say my main experience is with ayahuasca, and the reason why ayahuasca is because I got introduced to it by Gabor Mate. Gabor Mate has written books on addiction. He's very well respected in the field of mental health and trauma. And he said that the number one treatment he's seen for addicts is ayahuasca. And that intrigued me. A, I trusted him. And B, I trusted him before this. And when I heard him say this, I said, hey, let me see what he's talking about. And sure enough, I've seen a profound transformation in myself, especially as it relates to my addiction, after ayahuasca use.
Oh.
And I'm not talking about tons of experiences. I'm talking, a handful of experiences, and seeing a complete turnaround with the intensity needed to manage my addiction, the frequency of meetings, any feelings of anxiety or depression or the struggle. It just completely changed my perspective on life. Again, it's not a blanket recommendation for everyone, and obviously, whoever's listening, pay attention to your own situation, number one, and number two, the laws around it. They are changing, and there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of research going on in this space. So depending on when someone is listening to this and which state they're in and exactly how they're doing it, it may or may not be okay. So it's not a recommendation on any level for someone. But I do strongly believe, based on my own experiences and seeing many other people, that it would be a very good thing if these were made available to the healers and those seeking treatment or offering treatment to have access to these tools in the same way they have access to other things. I know people who've been on SSRIs for years, who not one or two journeys magic, and everything disappears, but psychedelics afforded them a completely different alternative for their healing path. And I've seen it for myself with my addiction and my anxiety and other things.
Have you seen that? I mean, if it rewires your brain to a certain extent, have you seen a person having their brain rewired in a negative way by taking ayahuasca or psilocybin or any of these?
Andrew,
I've heard of, you heard anecdotally stories about, this guy took ayahuasca and the guy's crazy now. I know it's not the case with you, but
Andrew Huberman talks about this. He recently released a podcast on psilocybin, its benefits and use, and he says many people talk about rewiring, and they make it sound like rewiring is a good thing. He says maybe is it adaptive rewiring or maladaptive rewiring, and that's an important distinction. I think that a lot of these are ancient medicines which have been used as medicines for many years, and when used appropriately should result in adaptive wiring. That being said, there are certain people who they strongly recommend against it, such as people with schizophrenia. There are certain health conditions that are not good for it. There are certain interactions with other medications that could be dangerous. And also, this is probably most important when talking about psychedelics, is that it's not as if someone takes it and then everything disappears. When new connections are formed, there's often new possibilities and new pathways that someone could choose to embark on. But it could sometimes be so different than the life they're living that it could throw them through some difficulty, right? So I have a friend who began working with ayahuasca and psilocybin, and he found it incapable to work afterwards. Like, how can I see those perspectives and go back to a mundane job? Not everyone is ready for that. And once he saw what he saw, he wasn't able to generate the same motivation for work. So he was kind of stuck in between two worlds. And that sometimes does happen, right? So it's definitely before entering it, even the biggest proponents of it, if someone is a big proponent of it, it's because they understand it to be a powerful tool. And I think it's a powerful tool that generally is positive if used correctly, and if the person is prepared for it and he does a proper integration afterwards. But not everyone is ready for it. And I know some people who felt kind of pressured into it, or they did it for some reason but didn't really understand what they were signing up for. And it did destabilize them in some way, not to the point that they went crazy, but more of, I saw something that doesn't match with the way I'm living, and I can't unsee it, but I also don't feel like I can change the way I'm living.
But in the case of your friend, it's mostly about the experience and not the so-called, quote-unquote, rewiring of the brain. It's mostly about the experience that they had. They probably saw something and they cannot live their life normally after the experience. Not because there were certain circuits triggered, or,
I'll tell you why it's both, is because I have certain things I've seen on psychedelics which have changed my perspective about something, and that sits in my mind. And there are other things that just kind of changed, and there's no vision or experience or knowledge that I can point it back to and say, oh, this happened because of that. It just it just kind of disappeared. It wasn't there anymore. I can't tell you exactly why so much of my anxiety left. There wasn't this experience I saw was being held by God and saying, I got you, I got you, I got you, don't worry. And I said, oh, of course I'm not going to worry. And anytime I do, I just think back to this vision. It wasn't that. But somehow the anxiety that I lived with for as long as I can remember just doesn't reside in me today.
Why do you think there's this stigma around that? I mean, I think it's related to legality of it, but people see like SSRIs are completely fine and are highly encouraged by some people, but whereas psychedelics or ayahuasca or psilocybin are, people get scared about it, or people, do you think it's correlated to the legality of it?
That's a huge component, right? The war on drugs, which is what the legality is connected to. So having that messaging for years, 100%. A lot of people have asked me, is this a drug? I don't see it that way. I see it as a medicine. What's the difference? And not just to use semantics, what's the difference between a medicine and a drug? Is a drug is something you'll constantly need, and usually you need more of, right? Alcohol is a drug. Why do I say it's a drug? Because you're drinking it to get some sort of feeling. Let's say someone feels self-conscious, so they drink alcohol so they can interact socially like a normal person. The first time they drink an ounce. You follow up with them 10 years later, and now they're drinking a half a bottle for that same feeling. Whereas anyone who works with these plants, with psychedelics, will report, anyone that I've spoken to will report being more and more sensitive to it over time. So maybe at the beginning, they needed to do 4 experiences in 10 days. But then a year later, they feel okay, or they're doing just, once. Maybe at the beginning, they needed, 4 cups of ayahuasca to even feel it. And now they smell it and they're right back in the experience. So it actually works more as a medicine than a drug, in that it seems to heal something and make you need less and less of that same substance over time. But the final reason why I think it's so different than a drug is, and it's not that it is different than a drug, right? Someone can use, for example, when I spoke with Matthew Johnson from Johns Hopkins University, he said that he expects that within a year, MDMA therapy will be legal. He says because the studies have been phenomenal on it, especially for PTSD, but also for other things. Now, some people use it as a drug, and they use it as a party drug.
Yeah.
If and when this becomes legal, this will start to be used not as a drug, as a medicine. So what's the practical difference? Someone asked this to Gabor Mate, isn't just another drug? Why are you telling someone who's drug addicted to use ayahuasca? So he said a lot of it goes into the intent. When someone is taking a drug, as a drug, they're doing it with the intent of escaping. Say, why are you drinking this alcohol? I'm drinking it because I had a stressful day and I want to escape from that reality for this evening, or sometimes even more than that, right? For a few months. So they keep drinking alcohol. Whereas someone using ayahuasca or psilocybin or MDMA in a therapeutic setting, and you ask them, what is your intention for it? Their intention is not to disconnect and escape, but to connect to themselves. You'll hear things, I want to understand myself better. I want to be a better father. I want to be a better parent. I want to be a better member of society. They're actually looking to connect. And what's scary about it is actually the confrontation that it sometimes creates with oneself and with one's actual reality. These aren't great tools to escape from things. Not that they can't be used that way, but they're not the best tools for it. So
super interesting.
And why there's a stigma, I think there's the war on drugs is a big part of that component. I think the stigma is certainly lessening because of the fact that the studies are so positive and so many people are reporting positive experiences from it, and people are seeing changes. I know therapists who I've spoken to who said, at first I was very, very skeptical of these things, but then I see changes in my patients, so how can I deny it? So obviously the war on drugs played a major, major role. And then I think when it comes to religious circles, and most people are religious in some way, whether it's a Christian background, a Jewish background, a Muslim background, most people have that, and they hear about the spiritual experiences that are people having on psychedelics, they right away will go to something like, is this a false deity? Is this idol worship? Is this somehow incompatible with my religion? And I think that's another reason why these are often met with such stigma.
Have you spoken to Jewish leaders or rabbis or spiritual figures about psilocybin or psychedelics in general? What's the Jewish view on that?
I know many who've used it, personally, and are very positive. I know some who are extremely skeptical and nervous about it. I think that this will probably be one of the main things the Jewish community wrestles with, certainly the Orthodox Jewish community wrestles with over the next few years, is how to incorporate the use of psychedelics, especially the ceremonial ones like ayahuasca, into and to be compatible within Judaism. But what I would say is that it's hard to meet someone today who's speaking to people, because there's a lot of use of this. I mean, it's fairly common in a lot of different circles. It's hard to speak to someone today who can't at least acknowledge that they've seen certain benefits with certain segments of society, and it would be appropriate for them. So even the strongest opinion that I've heard against it from a rabbi has been it's being used too commonly with people who don't need it. Not that no one should ever use it under any circumstance. I think a rabbi would have a very difficult time reading a study published from Johns Hopkins that there were over 50 people who took psilocybin 1 to 2 times and all of them have reported some increase in their depression or other symptoms, other emotional symptoms that they were dealing with, and then tell someone who's, going to die within 24 months, don't use this. Will they tell someone who's struggling with mild depression or someone who just can't figure out what's bugging them that maybe you should try this? Less likely. But I think it's something the Jewish community has to and will wrestle with over the next little while.
I mean, yeah, you can also say the same thing about antidepressants or SSRIs. I mean, I think the statistic, and perhaps the team can help us with the statistic again, but it's like 40% of adults in the US are currently in antidepressants, which is crazy amount. Like, I mean, I don't know if it's a staggering amount. So, I mean, from a Jewish point of view, you can make the same criticism about SSRIs in this case as well. But I don't see that movement happening, like
I think
Orthodox rabbis coming out.
So the Jewish community generally, the position will be to follow the medical establishment. That will be the ultimate Jewish position. Is if the medical establishment moves in a certain direction, then by and large the Jewish community will follow that direction. The one difference here is the ceremonial aspect, like I said, of certain plants and how much of that may be rooted in practices that are contrary to Judaism. And the other is the spiritual quality of so many of the experiences that people have, and how do you reconcile that with Judaism. I think that's going to be the easier part to reconcile, just like people had to reconcile how the 12 steps is compatible with Judaism, because the 12 steps is filled with the word spirituality, God, meditation, prayer. It has all of those components, and the Jewish world did wrestle with that for a while and eventually understood how there's nothing sacrilegious or against Judaism about this. And not everyone understood it. There were certain rabbis who were very against the 12 steps for exactly that reason. But by and large, the Jewish community is very accepting of people going to 12-step meetings. So I think that component will be much easier to sort out, the spiritual experiences people have on psychedelics. The ceremonial aspects, I think we'll wrestle with maybe for a while.
Awesome. I want to ask you one last question. What is some advice that you would give to people struggling with watching porn in general, or any addiction for that matter, specifically watching porn, whether it's an addiction or it's just, something, some people want to, watch less porn than what they're watching right now, or in general addictions. What would you advise them to do, and what's your advice in general for young men or young people that are struggling with this?
My main advice to people is don't give it and don't take it. So don't give advice, don't take advice. I think that, someone listening to my personal story, if something resonates with them, I'm not looking to convince anyone of anything. I speak, I share my story, I share my experiences. And if something in there resonates with someone and they hear in that a problem that they have today, and they hear something in me that they want something of what I'm vibrating today, then you can hear what I have to say, but I'm not offering advice.
All right, that's a great ending. Thanks, Eli, for joining. Thank you so much. And everyone, please subscribe to Eli's channel. We'll put the link below. Follow him on social media, connect with him on social media. And until next time, thanks,
Thank
Eli.
you so much. Thanks for the opportunity. Have a wonderful day. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.